The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to this very short webinar, and we're going to look at team identity and give you an opportunity to look at this from the point of view of your own team and what you might be able to do to improve your team's identity. So there are a number of things that we'll cover in this short, sharp session, but one of the things I want to say to you up front is that if you look over on the right-hand side, you'll see a question box there, and if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask me, just type them in the question box there, and what will happen is that I'll see it straight away. No one else gets to see it, and I'll respond during the presentation. I won't be leaving a 10-minute pause at the end for questions, because it might just be an awkward pause where no one's got any questions because they haven't thought of them at that stage. So just ask questions as they arise. Now, the topic that I'm talking about today is coming from my latest book, as you can see on the screen there. And that book will be published later this year. You can pre-order that book, and I've got a good deal for you that I'll explain towards the end of this process. Okay, so I've just got a question here from, oh no comment. Okay, excellent. All right, let's get stuck into the topic, and let's look at this whole concept of team identity. Three things I want to cover in this short session today. I want to talk obviously about what team identity is. So what is it? Because I think sometimes it becomes a strange sort of topic about team identity. I want to talk about that. And in particular, I want to talk about the elements of team identity. And I've identified three elements of team identity that's unique. It's my own research, it's my own work in this area, and of course, I talk about it at great length in the book. And of course, I want to talk about some of the strategies that you can think about and apply in your own team to strengthen the team identity that you have. And basically, we're done. Okay, so that's what we're going to be covering in this short session. All right, so what is team identity? Let's start with that. Let's try and understand and unpack this concept of team identity and what it means. So when I talk about team identity, I'm referring to the extent to which the team members identify with your team. So they have an identification with the team, a very strong emotional bond with the team. That's ultimately what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the stronger a team's identity, the more the members connect with the team's ethos, what you're about, and people's identity is tied up in the team. So if you have a compelling team identity, this results in people readily associating themselves with your team before the organisation. So they see their identity more likely to be part of the team than the overall organisation of which the team is part of. So that's what we essentially mean by team identity. Team identity, I should say, does not mean team cohesion. So it's not a concept where we talk about, the fact that a team is very cohesive. That doesn't necessarily, that's not exactly what I mean by team identity. It's more around how people see their identity in the organisation as part of the team. All right, so that's essentially what team identity is all about. And again, as I said before, if you've got any questions or comments, go to the question box or anything at all, any observations at all. So let's talk about my model of team identity. And as you can see on the screen, this is the team identity model. And ultimately what it is you can see there are three basic elements around team identity. Now I've referred to these as the 3 B's. So we've got buffering, we've got bridging, and we've got building. So I'm going to talk about buffering, bridging, and building, because ultimately they're the three elements as a leader that you need to be aware of if you're trying to build a better team identity. So these are deliberate efforts that you can make in order to create a stronger team identity. And I'm going to refer to each of those and talk about them in some detail. Each of them have got a different focus. For example, buffering is a focus where you're protecting the team from outside influences that might come in and cannibalize your team's resources. Bridging is an actual external focus, that is working with other stakeholders both within the organisation and outside the organisation. And building is very much an internal focus where you're building a team culture. And each of those three have a critical role to play in developing this strong team identity that I've been talking about. So, of course, any team leader can subconsciously work on these things, and they do create a team identity, whether it's a weak or a strong team identity. I'm suggesting that being aware of it today, that you can place more energy and effort into buffering, bridging, and building. So let's talk about buffering, bridging, and building in a little bit more detail, just to understand what they mean and how they relate to team identity. So what I want to do is start with the first one, which is essentially buffering. Now, I could have perhaps used a different word from that, but when I talk about buffering, what I'm really talking about as the first element of team identity is the concept that's involved in protecting your team's resources from unwanted outside influence, distractions, and interferences. Now, obviously, there are you don't work in a vacuum. You don't work on a desert island. Obviously, what happens is that you've got a number of people that you have to interact with, both within the organisation and beyond. And of course, if you don't interact with those stakeholders, what happens, of course, is the team isn't effective. However, having said that, there are some influences that can come in and cannibalize your team and undermine its performance. So it's a very fine balance between having this stakeholder liaison, but also protecting your team from unwanted influences within the team. So without having a buffering strategy, other teams and individuals can easily, as I say, cannibalize your team's resources. And when I talk about team resources, I'm talking about the people, I'm talking about the administrative resources and the technical. So any of those could be under threat if the team leader doesn't make sure that the team is sufficiently and appropriately protected from those outside influences. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that shortly so that you understand what I'm talking about. And I'm sure some of you would relate to some of those. You'd be aware of some of those outside influences that get in the way of your team actually performing. So let's have a look at some of those now. And I'm going to put up on the screen in a moment when it comes up. There we are. Here's some examples. Now, you'll get these slides incidentally, and you'll also get the recording. So you'll get those this afternoon when I send you out an email. So let's have a look at some of the potential outside influences that can impact on a team's performance. And what I've done is I've identified some human, technical, and administrative resources that could be threatened. The team's performance could be threatened. So let's take the first one there. So let's say that you've got another team in your organisation who's short-staffed, and they start exerting pressure on your team to perhaps redeploy one of your team members to bring them across to their team so that they can perform their tasks. So it might be somebody in the team that's actually been in the previous team before, and there's a bit of argy-bargy that goes on about trying to use that person in another team. But the reality is that person could be very effective and important to your team. Now, of course, it's a judgment call. You may see that in the interest of the organisation, that would be a fair and reasonable thing to do, to allow somebody to be, temporarily or even permanently working in another team. But it could also be detrimental to your team's performance as well. So that's a human resource constraint. What about another human resource constraint? If an organisation, for example, is working in a matrix organisation, that is an organisation that's got a hierarchy and also projects involved, and I know some of you in this webinar have that sort of arrangement in your organisation, there's always going to be a tension between the project or the function. So, for example, a project manager in the organisation might be insisting on one of your team members to attend a number of meetings, and this team member of yours comes back and reports back to you and says it's a complete waste of time. I'm getting nothing out of these meetings and I don't know why I need to attend. So that would be an opportunity for you as a team leader to say to that, to suggest to the project manager that this person really should be exempted from that project team meeting because, one, they're not finding it useful, and secondly, it's interfering with the work that they're doing. Because obviously every hour that one of your team members spends outside your team is not really 1 hour, it's really 2 hours, because not only are they spending that hour working, say, in a meeting or something, but it also means that, of course, they're not spending an hour doing what they should be doing in your project team, in your team. So that's an example, that's another example of a human resource. Another one, which would be an administrative resource, is that maybe excessive administrative procedures, that might suffocate your team with red tape. I'm sure you're aware of what I'm talking about, that other parts of the organisation are getting your team to, dot I's and cross T's excessively. And all of that red tape is, of course, taking attention away from what your team is actually supposed to be doing. And of course, as a good team leader, you would try and do what you could to minimise or eliminate some of that red tape so that your team members' time and effort is more effectively exerted towards whatever your team's service or product that you're producing would be. A final example, which would be a technical resource, is a manager takes possession of what they believe might be a spare computer in your work area. So they take that because there's nobody there at that desk, not knowing, of course, that you would be recruiting a new person next week. So they would just take that resource thinking that it's, virtually a free resource, and that would be a time when you'd interfere. So I'm not suggesting for a minute that your job is to be completely selfish and only think about your team. But I am suggesting this, that if you don't spend enough time buffering some of these outward distractions, it's likely that your team is not going to be performing to the level that it should be. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's buffering. So let's now look at the next one. And this of course is bridging. Now, bridging is exactly the opposite of buffering. What I mean by that is that bridging is an external focus. So while buffering looks at the internal mechanisms to shield the team, bridging actually engages in reaching out to the critical people in the organisation that will give the team an opportunity to perform. And of course, an obvious example of that would be your boss. Your boss, no doubt, is not a member of your team, but you would have to agree that they are critically important to the success of your team, because obviously if your relationship with them is poor, it's likely to impact negatively on your team. So that would be an example of spending time building a better working relationship up with another stakeholder, in this case your boss. So having a constructive working relationship with key stakeholders obviously enables your team to achieve its objectives. So it's critically important. So you can see we've got these two forces at play. Buffering is making sure we don't have unnecessary influence, and bridging is making sure we reach out and build good stakeholder relationships with key people who will assist the team to achieve its objectives. And so you've got this dual force going on, and it's really important that you give emphasis to both of those elements. So if you strengthen your alliances within and outside the organisation, robust business relationships and partnerships will galvanise the team's relevance. And of course, one of the things that you can do is actually map out who your stakeholders are, and actually do this with your team members. Why? Because you're going to get better input, you're going to get better engagement, and just spend a bit of time thinking, well, who are our key stakeholders? That's a good question to ask. And then the next question might be, what can we do to improve our working relationship with those stakeholders and get the team involved in that process. So that's the bridging element of team identity. So again, if you've got any questions or comments, just type them in the question box there and I'll be happy to respond to those. All right, now the third element is building. Now you might say, are these in order of importance? I would suggest to you, you have to have all three of these elements working for you to build a more effective team identity. So building is an internal mechanism, and building really involves cultivating a sustainable, productive workplace culture. In other words, a team culture. All teams have a culture, regardless of whether you put any effort in or not. It's far better to be overt about that and start working. And I've got a number of different ways of doing that in my book. So harnessing the benefit, for example, of diversity in your team, not just diversity in terms of age or sex or anything else like that. It could be about diversity of the way people think. So that could be one way, or streamlining your systems and processes to make sure that they're relevant to what you're supposed to be doing in your organization. We're all working with systems and processes that aren't quite working for us. And so finding the time to sit down with your team and work out a better process, a simpler process, or indeed no process, sometimes is very, very useful time spent. So like buffering, building is actually, as I said before, an internal focus, because obviously it's about your team members. So, but unlike buffering, where the energy is devoted to keeping at bay those external distractions, building is actually an activity where you're directing the energies and enterprise of your members towards your team members towards a common purpose. Could I walk up to any of your team members and say to them, what's the purpose of your team? Would they be able to rattle off something that you were happy with? Would they be able to give me in a one sentence statement, this is what our team does? And would you be happy with their responses? That might be something useful for you to try in a team meeting, is just to go around the table and ask people, what's the purpose of our team? You might think it's a very basic question, but I think you might be quite surprised, and perhaps unpleasantly surprised, when you hear the variation of views around the table. So in contrast to bridging, where the effort is directed on important critical resources and cooperation in the wider landscape, building entails utilising the team resources within the team to improve the team's capacity to do their job more effectively. So the question is, I guess at this point, what do you need to do? I mean, now that you're aware that there's these three elements of team identity, what do you need to concentrate on in order to improve and strengthen your team identity, which is a very practical question. So let me share with you a bigger model. Now you'll notice that I'd shared with you earlier this model, which is the buffering, bridging and building. And you'll notice on the screen that there are a number of characteristics that create another layer. These characteristics are the characteristics to focus on in order to improve that element. So you'll notice here for buffering, we've got three. We've got building trust, sharing leadership, being agile. For bridging, we have two, managing stakeholders and creating purpose. And for building, we have three, improving systems, utilizing diversity, and learning continuously. So these are the building blocks for you to take it to the next level. So in the buffering area, how do you buffer your team? Well, you need to build trust up in your team, because by building trust, you'll get people to communicate internally, to problem solve, to think laterally about how we might stop these outside distractions from getting in the way of what our team should be doing. By sharing the leadership, you are using the resources in your team in order to be flexible. So this might require, some multitasking. This might require, multi-skilling. And of course, being agile and creating a culture of agility will help buffer the team so that when something happens outside the team can regroup and recalibrate quickly based on these external forces that come into play. So they're the ones, and of course I go into those in great detail in the book. So if you look at bridging, you've got two things that you need to be mindful of. Well, the obvious one is that you need, as a team leader, to manage your stakeholders. You need to have good working relationships with your stakeholders, and you need to be able to build bridges, if you like, which is, of course, the element. And you also, interesting enough, need to create a purpose. So the purpose of the team and sharpening that focus. So what is the purpose of your team? And do your team members align with that purpose? And then do other people, that is the other stakeholders outside the team, are they aware of the purpose of your team? Because it's surprising how few people are actually aware of what other teams do. For example, you hear lots of people denigrating HR, or you hear people talking about finance are just bean counters, and you hear all these comments that are made about teams, when in actual fact the work that those teams do is far more sophisticated than the simple labels that other people will put on those teams. So creating a purpose is not just about creating the purpose within your team, but it's also communicating that purpose to other teams so that they actually understand what your team's on about. And the third element, of course, is the building, and that is the building of a culture. And there are three things that I alluded to earlier that become critically important for that need. One of those is in sharpening and improving the systems that your team uses. So, auditing and you might say, well, where do I start? I've got all these systems in place and we're being pushed from pillar to post. We've got a lot of work on. The place to start is with the systems and the processes where the team spends the most time on. Why? Because by getting some improvement in those systems and processes, you will exponentially increase your time and effort and energy. So, if there's certain forms that are being filled out and they take a considerable amount of time, then obviously that might be a place to start. So how can we simplify those forms? How can we make them more relevant to the needs that we have? Now, you may have to have a conversation with someone outside your team that's imposing this on you, but that might be time well spent. How can you utilize the diversity of your team, as I mentioned earlier? And I think diversity comes in all different shapes and forms. There is no question that the research demonstrates conclusively that diversity is critically important to any team's success. If for no other reason, then you get a number of different opinions and perspectives around the table. You should be encouraging that, because if everyone thinks the same way, then everyone's going to be deluded that this is the way we do things and that's what we should be doing. But the reality is, by having somebody who might say, well, hang on a minute, I've got a different way of doing things, this is what I think, and then other people are prepared to listen to that point of view. They don't have to go along with it, but it gives people an opportunity to be able to identify that. And the final characteristic that will underpin the building element would be learning continuously. And you've heard this said many, many times, and it sounds like it's a little bit of a cliche. But if you look at any high-performing team in the sporting world, anyone, it wouldn't matter who they were, I will guarantee to you one thing: they are always on a quest to get better, faster, more agile, whatever it might be, whatever the sport is. They're always on a quest to improve their performance, and that comes from continuous learning. So, for example, a very simple example that I talk about in the book: after you've completed a project, instead of just moving straight on to the next one, a good thing to do would be to actually sit down with your team members and do what we call an after-action review, to actually sit there and say, okay, what went well? What didn't go well? And what will we do differently? Now, that could take you 20 minutes of conversation in a team, but I'll guarantee to you the learnings that come out of that could be quite important in terms of improving your team's ability to deal with the next challenge that's similar. So there you are. There's 8 characteristics. There are 3 elements, and all of those things add up to the concept that I'm talking about around team identity. So if you've got any questions, now's the time to ask, because we're just about done. I just want to, if I may, just indulge you here for a moment in a special offer that I've got, and I'd like to share that with you. And here's the offer. The offer is this. Now, as you know, I've got a book coming out called Winning Teams: Applying the All Blacks Formula to Your Team. Now that's coming out. It's not out yet, but if you order that book, which will cost you $30, you will receive a free online course on building highly effective teams. In other words, we'll go into some of this information in more depth, and that would be valued at $675. If you send me an email by the close of business today, and I'll remind you when I send you an email with the slides and the recording, if you do that, I send you an invoice, and then what happens is that I also send you a link into the online learning system, and you can start applying these things immediately to your team for the price of $30, which is a very reasonable deal. I'm sure you'd agree. And of course, when the book is out, I'll send it to you and I'll sign it for you and all that sort of thing. So you'll get the book as soon as it gets published. We don't have a publishing date yet. So folks, that's it from me. I'm just checking to see. Okay, no questions. All right, all good. Okay, so that's it from me. So I'd just like to wish you a happy weekend wherever you are, and send me an email, get that book sorted, and I'll send you an invoice, and I'll give you the links to the website and all the rest. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and just remember there's a whole bunch of other team free webinars that I've got available on my website, www.winnersatwork.com.au. Thanks everyone, see you next time, and all the best. Thank you and goodbye.